In this video, we will refine some of the skills that you've already learned concerning logical outlining. The first step in doing so is to remind ourselves what it is we mean by a summary or a customary outline. Then we'll proceed to a logical outline and indicate the differences. Notice on the left then, the goal of a summary outline is to basically shrink or distill the contents of anything we're looking at so we can identify discrete portions of it, simplify the apprehension of it. When doing a summary outline, one basic rule is in biblical material, we don't want to take the liberty of reshuffling the verses. Live with them the way they are presented to us. We operate from the assumption that the writer put them in the order they are for a reason. Second, be sure whenever you issue a heading or a subheading, please give the courtesy of indicating in parentheses directly after what is the span of verses that this heading represents. Third, we want to respect the headings and the subheadings. Here you find two sample outlines for the birth of Ishmael, one at the bottom of the first column, another at the top of the second column. As you look at heading 1, events preceding Ishmael's birth, verses 1 to 14, this indicates that any subheadings thereunder should be confined to and represent all of verses 1 through 14. In other words, if we found verse 17 explained or commented in under heading 1, that's not respecting the heading that it's under. Subordinated under is what we're saying. Similarly, if subpoint 1a stretched from verses 1 to 2, and then subpoint 1b started with verse 4a, we'd have a problem because verse 3 would be skipped or not accounted for. So by respecting the headings, we mean don't put additional information than under a heading than what you've announced in its verse span, and don't leave out anything you've announced. It does not mean that every verse needs a single dedicated heading. You can see from this example, verses 1 through 4a are all accounted for with heading 1a, Sarai's suggestion. Top of the middle column, you can see a breakdown that does not respect the headings and subheadings. Notice the span of verses in the first heading, Sarai's suggestion, in column 2. It spans verses 1 through 4a. So that announces to us that anything subordinate to that should not trespass beyond 4a. But notice the first subheading. We have Sarai's change of mind starting at 4a, not starting at verse 1. Furthermore, it extends into verse 6, which trespasses the boundary announced by the superior heading Sarai's suggestion 1 through 4a. Further, the next subordinate heading below, letter B, God's encounter with Hagar, picks up at verse 7, extends through 14, which is far exceeding the limit announced by the superior heading Sarai's suggestion 1 through 4a. So this is what we mean as a negative example regarding the importance of respecting the headings and subheadings. Let's look at item 4 in the second column, identifying sections. The headings that you announce for your passage should naturally arise from the flow of the passage itself. You won't see them initially. What it takes is reading and rereading and reading again until you recognize where there are shifts, where there are changes in the information that's given. Sometimes students initially attempting an assignment like this are slavishly bound to verse divisions, so they submit an outline where every verse earns a heading. As soon as we see this, it should raise naturally the suspicion that probably a person has not really gotten the feel of the flow, for it would be very unusual for, say, a 15-verse passage to have 15 different ideas that have the same weight or impact on what the author is saying. chances are 2 or 3 are going to go together. Maybe a group of 6 will go together, and then within those 6 verses there will be some subordinate or some smaller ideas that indicate movement. That's the kind of sensitivity we're trying to grasp. In fact, it's that error of issuing the same level of subordination to every specific verse that's identified or meant by point number 5. Avoid the shotgun approach, because that produces a very flat rendition of the passage, and it's highly likely that it is not representing the flow, the dynamic ebb and flow of the passage itself. Step number 6 is specific to summary outlines, and you will see that this is one step that will change when we move to logical outlines. The idea of a summary outline is that we would reduce the content to a phrase. We're specifying a phrase, saying not a complete sentence. That will change with logical outlines. I will ask you to use complete sentences. Item 7, in the case of summary outlines, it's very wise and helpful if the outlines are consistent. Sometimes that means that if you use a participle in ing form like walking, seeing, looking, giving, that each heading, at least at the same level of subordination, would follow that kind of a consistent expression, and that makes it easier for the reader to realize what's related together. When we shift over to logical outlines, we'll want a measure of consistency, but we will be allowing more latitude in order to represent the dynamism of the passage at any given heading area. Step number 8, top of column 3, developing subordination. I encourage, and this will apply to logical outlines as well as summary, but we'll be winding up working on logical outlines. I encourage you to develop 2 or 3 levels of subordination. If you're wondering what this means, look over to the first column. The lower portion, you have the birth of Ishmael, that's the title. And then first major heading is set at the number 1 level. That's one level of subordination. That's the most a major heading. And then there's a subpoint, 1a. That's subordinated to heading Arabic numeral 1. What you see there offers 2 levels of subordination, the Arabic numeral and then the lowercase letter a. I'm going to ask, and this will hold true for logical outlines, that you have at least 2 levels of subordination, like you see there in the birth of Ishmael outline, or advance it to 3. I'm going to put a limit at the level of 3 because I don't want this assignment to require you to go too tedious or to spiral down too deeply. If you wish to do so when you're doing your own work, that's fine. It can wind up taking too much vertical space in an outline presentation. So for the purposes of this course, please go at least to 2 levels and often to 3. Now let's shift in column 3 to Roman numeral 2, logical outline. In contrast to the goal of summary outlines, our objective here is to, as it says, tap into the dynamism of the passage. Sometimes this skill is known as concept mapping. We are engaging a sophisticated mental skill in distilling the content into concepts and then mapping them, not just naming them out in static fashion, but showing how they hook together and move. If you're wondering why is this beneficial, any passage will have highs and lows. Just as with a story, a narration, you will have prominent information and then supportive detail. I hope it's not too easy to realize, or not too difficult, rather, to realize that if you're teaching or preaching, you're going to want to major on the main points. And in some cases, you will not even mention the detail. It will not be sufficiently important to warrant time in your teaching or preaching. A logical outline helps you distinguish main points from subordinate points. And now letter B in the column on the right. Guidelines. For many people, it will be useful to begin with a summary outline when you're trying to piece out the portions that comprise a given passage. Why? Because this is what we're accustomed to. So my encouragement is to go ahead and on scratch paper. Why? Because I'm not requiring you to show me the summary outline. But go ahead and just rapidly or as quickly as you can scratch out what you think of as an outline. Don't worry about some of the details. Of course, you need to honor points that we showed there on the left, adding verse numbers, retaining verse sequence, respecting headings, things that are normal to a summary outline. Observe those, but don't worry about the details that we're going to advance in a logical outline initially. That can give you kind of a bedrock, a foundation, a toehold to get started. And then you could look at that and say, okay, now here's what I want to refine to move into a logical outline. Again, if it's helpful, start with a summary outline. If you're getting comfortable with doing logical outlines, then by no means do you need to spend time doing a summary outline just to please me. Next, and this point, B2, namely ask, why is this segment here, may be the most distinguishing feature of moving from a summary to a logical outline. When we're posing the question, why is this segment here, we're referring to any heading, any span of verses that are in a heading or a subheading. And we are asking, why is it in this slot, this sequence of the material, and not presented earlier or later? Why is it at this slot? If you think of it as a baseball arrangement, home plate, first, second, third, and you drop your verses right in order. You got some verses that are at first base, and then it goes a little ways, and you have the next group of verses at second base and some at third base. We're looking at the verses at second base, the ones that you clustered there, and we're asking, well, why didn't the writer put those on first base? Why didn't they come first? Or you look at the ones at home plate. Why were these left for the conclusion? Why is this last? That's what we mean by why is it the segment here? Why is it in this sequence? By the way, in this video, I'm often not stopping to read what is typed before you. This is a place where you might want to pause the video and just read that paragraph, because there you'll find some examples of subpoint 2, ask, why is this segment here? And now please direct your attention to the new material that appears in the far right column. Number 3, look for stairways, not for loose blocks. Look for stairways, not for loose blocks. By blocks, I'm referring to pieces of information, headings actually, right? Headings and subheadings. And I'm using the analogy of archaeology. If you're digging around in a tell, in an ancient mound, and you see some stones that have been purposely chiseled, they're not just what we call field stones, they've actually been shaped to do some some architectural task, then you might be looking at them and asking, did these used to be fashioned in a stairway, or were they just foundation stones in a string or something like that? All right. When we're switching from that analogy over to content, to literary content, we want to look at the sequencing, the last task, ask why is this segment here, and ask if they are going somewhere. That is to say, heading A, heading B, heading C, are they leading us somewhere? So it's related to step 2, but looking particularly for progression. And now please notice step 4, again on the right column. Communicate your outline in paraphrase sentences with appropriate connectives. So paraphrase sentences and appropriate connectives. These are 2 subpoints. Notice first of all paraphrase. It's very valuable to embrace this discipline that when you craft a heading or subheading, you steel yourself not to simply parrot the biblical words. Admittedly, that would get the job done, but here's what it misses. It misses a very important mental, what should we say, deepening. It misses getting you to the concept. At this stage, we don't want to just parrot the words. We want to be asking, what's the concept that's being conveyed here? When we do so, we want to not recycle the words that we see, but use other words to say it. Now, admittedly, sometimes this will become artificial. You'll read your carefully, dutifully paraphrased headings, and it will sound just a little bit odd because you're saying to yourself, I'm not allowed to use the words that are there. So, for example, if you've got "the Lord is my shepherd," you can't use "Lord" and you can't use "shepherd" in your heading. So what do you say? My superior cares for me. Something like that. We're moving to the concept of a shepherd, one who cares, the concept of a Lord, someone who is superior to me. We're not using the words we see. We're trying to capture the concept and expressing it consequently in other words other than what we see. Let me just comment at this point again. Sometimes it will feel a little strange, and you'll look at that and say, well, I did what the instructor asked me to, but frankly, if I were to move this later on to a preaching outline, I'm certainly not going to be bound by that restriction. Okay, that can happen. So this can be a temporary discipline just to get us past simply mechanically reproducing the words of the scripture itself. So getting to the concept is really, really valuable, and paraphrasing can help us. Last item on the right column, item B, is use complete sentences. All right, here we are drastically deviating from the traditional guidelines of a summary outline. There you don't use full sentences. Here's the deal. When we avoid using a verb in a sentence, that is to say, when we avoid using a verb in a heading, consequently we use a phrase for the heading and not a full sentence, we extract the energy from it. What we want to do with a logical outline is hang on to the energy. We still want to be working at the concept level. We still want it to be an outline. That is, it's going to be shrinking the overall information presentation of the passage. We're making a courtesy by distilling it down. But I'm going to ask you that every heading and subheading would be a sentence. Once in a while, they'll run on, like heading 1A might be half of a sentence that, because of the content, is actually finished in heading 1B. So sometimes it'll be a half sentence, but when you put those headings together, you can see it makes a full sentence. And you watch what happens. You'll find that when you're forced to search around for a verb to fit into your headings, you are going to have to almost put a stethoscope on the passage and say, what's the energy? What's the dynamism that's going on here? Again, these will be paraphrased verbs. You'll be interpolating them. You will not just be parroting them, but it will force you to listen to the passage. And folks, that is one of the major objectives of this discipline. It's not an easy one. It's probably the most sophisticated discipline that I'll be asking you to cultivate in this course. But when you do it well, you will find that not only do you have your hands around the passage, but the passage will have its hands around your soul. And that's where we want it to be. All right, we've added another column on the right. So far we've talked about paraphrasing, we've talked about complete sentences, and now we add the element connectives. Employ appropriate connectives. Do you remember the idea of step 2, the bottom of the far left column? Ask why this segment is here. Why is it on second base and not on first or third as far as sequencing of ideas in a passage. It's one thing to have an idea. Why is it on second base? It's another thing to be able to communicate what you see. Connectives are how you communicate why it is that you understand a given heading to be located in that sequence. So connectives will be a word or a phrase that you will invent. Most of the time it will come right at the beginning of a heading, and it will tell the reader how that heading relates to what's before and perhaps to what's after. We'll see some examples of this soon. Item 5. This again has to do with the energy, retaining the energy of the passage. Perhaps we can illustrate this idea of retaining the person of the original passage easiest by negative. Think of Psalm 23. The Lord is my shepherd. My, that's first person. That's the I, first person, not second person you, not third person he. But you know what happens when we use a summary outline? Summary outlines, the assumption is we flatten everything to third person. If it started in first person, that doesn't matter. Consequently, a summary outline of Psalm 23 would not have I language in it. It would say something like, the pilgrim or the poet speaks of the Lord as someone who cares for him. We wouldn't say I. All right. When we do so, that's fine for summary outline, but it bleeds out the intimacy of the passage. Consequently, to retain the energy and the directness, the immediacy of the passage, I'm going to ask that you carefully retain the person of the original passage. So if it says the Lord is my shepherd, then your logical outline is going to say something like, my master cares for me. Remember, we're paraphrasing. We're not using Lord. We're not using shepherd. We're keeping a verb in there, and we're keeping the voice, my master, and me, not the master cares for his followers. That would be third person. Retain the person. Watch as you do that, and you'll find it retains the energy. Does that mean every logical outline is going to be first person? No. It's just going to be faithful to whatever is the voice of the passage. So if the passage says, let's pick one that is third person, Psalm 1, blessed is the one who does not walk in the counsel. That's not blessed is me when that's already third person in the original. So then our logical outline for Psalm 1 will be third person. We're trying to be faithful to the passage. Step number 6 is optional. It reads, interject explanatory comments as needed. Optional in this sense. Let's suppose that when you get all done with your logical outline, you read it over and you say, wow, I know what I meant by these crystallized sentences paraphrased with connects. I know what I meant. I know why I feel it's faithful to the passage. But I'm not sure someone else picking this up, like the prof or a classmate picking it, I don't know if they're going to follow what I mean. I wish I could add some footnotes, just add a little more explanation, but my goodness, it would make the headings so wordy. So here's what you can do as a concession or as an option. You can add explanatory comments in a parallel column as needed. It's not my requirement, but it's just for you. Incidentally, I'm reading that bottom sentence on the right column, which says, in the following examples, connectives are placed in bold and explanatory comments are in the parallel column, right? Bold. That is really helpful, and I will ask you to retain that. So when there are connectives, that's top item on that right column, appropriate connectives, would you do this, please? Switch to bold font just for that portion of the heading. That way I know that you've consciously developed a connective, and these are the words that you feel represent that. Let's begin to look at some examples, and here I won't be talking through them thoroughly, but try and point out the high points so that you can see illustrated what we've talked about. First question that often comes up, we're looking at a table. is it necessary to produce logical outlines to turn in a tabular form like this? I would encourage you to do so. It can be one of the cleanest ways to arrange information and make sure that information is in place. Especially that's true when you're trying to match up explanatory columns and comments in the right column with the respective heading. So I would encourage you to do that. It's possible that using tables in word processing is new to you. It's on the Insert tab. You can insert and then specify a table. Not real difficult. If it's just absolutely a huge hurdle to you, you can do it in, what shall we say, you can do it without a table just by indenting your headings. And what should you do for explanatory? I guess you could switch over and italicize those and intersperse them. And when I see italicized, I'll know that that's, maybe put them in parentheses too, but intersperse them rather than having it in a parallel column. Question number 2. You're seeing 3 columns beginning with summary outline. Do I need to produce a summary outline for this assignment? No, you do not. That's provided here so that you can compare and see the difference. All that you need is the logical outline, and if you have any explanatory comments that you think will help me track with you, feel free to offer them wherever you think they're needed. Let's concentrate then on the logical outline. We have a title, A Son is Born to Abraham. By the way, that doesn't move to concept. Earlier I said try to stay away from the literal and go to concept. I'll admit that title does not. We would have to say something else to really put that at the concept level. Now, the subpoint 1 does begin to move to a concept level because it doesn't say Sarai was barren. It says, the deal with barrenness is that someone is experiencing a need. There's a deficiency. There's something that they're longing for. That's moving to a concept. As far as connectives go, by putting the word need in bold, we're serving notice that the reader should pay attention to that because it's going to relate to something before, well, not before because it's the first heading, but it will in fact refer to something later. It will connect. All right, we have the indication that heading 1 will span verses 1 through 6a. Notice that the subpoints A and B honor that heading. And we find some bold words in the first subheading. Letter A, so, is in bold. She devised her own solution is in bold. When those are in bold, then it directs me to look around and say, why does the writer think why does the outline person, myself in this case, think that this helps connect? Well, notice that the heading talked about a need, and now we have so. It's sending the message that devising a solution followed on logically on the heels of having a need. And this solution and the need and the so is a consequence. Let's move, and notice that's a full sentence. She devised her own solution. Now heading B, 1b, too late, Sarai discovered her mistake as sparks fly. Notice this is paraphrasing. We're moving to the concept. We're saying there's some stress items that are going on in the family dynamics. If you know the story, you know that's the kind of sparks that are flying. Too late then helps us appreciate the sequence of events and how this development stages. There's been a discovery. So this lets heading B be closely connected to. There's logical development. Let's hit the high spots and go down. Arabic 2, Hagar struggled with an immediate need. And then Arabic 2, the near lost son at last was born to Abram's family. So this helps lace it together. I'm going to proceed on to the next. This example is drawn from Daniel 1. So once again, we're working with narrative, just as the last one was. And your first assignment with logical outlining will put you in narrative. Concentrate on logical outline. We've got first the heading, indicating that it's spanning Daniel 1 verses 1 through 21. And subpoint Roman numeral 1, Life turned dismal for a bright lad. This is describing that Daniel is seized and taken into exile. So he's captive. That's the dismal. Bright lad, you may recall that he was a leader in his nobility, and the conquering armies pulled off the cream of the crop and took them into captivity. Subpoint 1a, foreign armies began by looting capital and temple. So Jerusalem is looted. And then notice the connective, that is the bold words in 1b. What is worse? As soon as you read that, it's telling you you've got to pay attention to what happened last in order to appreciate this. What is worse, they even carried off people. Not only loot, material gems and things, wealth, but they kidnapped people. This is where we are reflecting and helping to make explicit the dynamic development in the passage, making sure no one misses it. These bold words then are connectives. I encourage you to study this example, especially studying the connectives. You also may want to study the paraphrasing. At times I've succeeded in getting to concept level. Sometimes you may think, oh, it seems like it's pretty close to the actual content. Didn't use the same words, managed to paraphrase, but looks like we didn't succeed in really getting to the concept level. And I think you'll find some places where that's true, where this one can be improved on. But study that, see how verbs are used to form full sentences. Oh, about the full sentences, look at subpoint 1b, and under that, further subordinated 1, 2, and 3. Do you notice the ellipses? Let's read it. Subpoint 1. Youths, comma, the cream of the crop, were hauled off from old surroundings, ... hauled off to new diets and training, ... and finally were stripped of their very names. Earlier I suggested that although we want to have full sentences, sometimes a sentence will run on from one heading to the next. You see an example of that here. There is a full sentence, but it does happen to be stretched out. This shows the connectedness of these three subordinated headings under letter 1b. And eventually, with their verbs, they do form a complete, somewhat complex sentence. So this is an option. This next example then shifts over to poetry. And in the main, you will find that this skill of logical outlining will harvest even greater results, greater benefits in poetry than it will in prose. Reason being, poetry tends to move into concepts, theological themes, rather than reporting events from which we extrapolate theology. So it's often the case that poetry, poetry will be richer material within which to employ this discipline. It doesn't mean that narratives are fruitless, useless for logical outlining, but especially in poetry, it's useful. It can be more difficult to isolate the concepts, but already it's moving on topic level rather than chronological sequencing of events in a story. So here we have Psalm 32. Title, again, logical outline. Column, nothing feels so good as forgiveness. Notice that heading 1 spans verses 1 and 2. We've just grouped those together with no further subordination. Roman numeral 2 says, let me explain. Explain what? Well, explain the statement that's made just ahead. Namely, nothing soars like a cleared conscience. Somebody say, wow, tell me about that. Well, let me explain. I believe that starting in verse 3, it's an explanation of the exclamation made in verses 1 and 2. That's the logical relationship between 1 and 2 and 3 and following. I won't offer more comment here, but just say students who have been successful really getting this skill, they have sat with an example like this and, of course, their Bible, read the Bible psalm and said, how do you get from the Bible psalm to this outline? And by reconstructing that process, then the skill, the steps then become their own. Here's another example for you to walk through. This one is narrative, moving to the New Testament, Mark chapter 5. How about another New Testament example, this time not narrative, but rather epistolary, from a letter, so a teaching. And this will again be somewhat like working in poetry because it's presenting a series of ideas, not recounting a series of events. A few observations in closing. One practical item, the assignment as you have it asks that for your logical outline, you would follow it. That is, after you've set up your table and filled in your headings and so forth, you would then put a paragraph at the bottom which provides an overview. That's basically talking through the primary headings of your outline, as if you were to just string it out and explain it to someone without any point numbers and subpoints. The examples you've seen in this video do not provide any overview paragraphs. You will see that in other documents, other illustrative documents, but not in this particular one. Please don't forget to use them. Honestly, as I look at this Ephesians 3 outline, I think, there's a lot of room for improvement on this, particularly Roman numeral 2, 16 to 19. So I requested of him, and then look at the connectives. They're pretty much almost numerical sequencing. Initially, more important. Well, more important, that's nice. It tells you I got the impression that there was an escalating value at verse 17a. Secondarily, that doesn't seem very descriptive. Letter D, necessary penultimately, that's a word for next to last. Well, next to last, that's just a simple sequence. It doesn't really tell me dynamic contribution. Ultimately, letter E, ultimately, okay, that suggests that maybe importantly it's last and it may be reaching a climax. I think this could be improved on, which leads to another point, a question that some ask. Is there just one logical outline? Is there a perfect logical outline, shall we say, for every passage? Frankly, I don't think so. In other words, again, if you were to present an outline on this passage in Ephesians 3, I'll bet you there'd be some place where I'd say, I like your outline better than mine. Why? Now, here's the important thing. Because you would have succeeded in better accounting for certain material within the passage than I had. That's the thing to watch for. You want to account for what's really there and make it transparent, make it really clear in fresh language for someone else looking at it. Especially making clear groups of thought and stair-step sequence if there's a flow of thoughts, a logical development, concept mapping. Here's a final thought that can be a signal of a very well-produced logical outline. It's this. If you skate from Roman numeral 1, skip subpoints A and B, to Roman numeral 2, skip the 5 subpoints, to Roman numeral 3, you just read those one after the other. Roman numeral 1 heading, numeral 2 heading, numeral 3 heading. If they flow together, they kind of lockstep together and lead you through the high points of the outline, that is where logical outline consistency of heading is working at its best. We talked about consistency of heading in summary outlines, sometimes using an ing word, in each heading. Here is where consistency of logical outlining really pays off. As I look at the Roman numeral headings here, I find I would have to adjust them a little bit for them to really flow alone. Let me see if I can do that for you and you get the idea. I would adjust numeral 1 instead of finishing it with ellipses. I would say, here is the nature of the God to whom I appeal. Numeral 2, I would say, so, that is, in view of his nature, this is what I request of him. And then Roman numeral 3, anticipation of these blessings, that is, God supplying what I requested of him in Roman numeral 2, leads me to bless God, who is their source. So in that fashion, if I were to make those little tweaks, I would do a better job of illustrating the idea of back-to-back, same subordination level headings, reading them together, and it giving you a snapshot of the passage. That can render a significant service through a logical outline. Keep in mind that logical outlining is admittedly a very sophisticated process. That doesn't mean it's something to stand up and be proud of. It means it's a lot of work. So, for example, when you're done and you've got a logical outline that just takes a page, chances are it has taken you hours to get there. So don't underestimate it. It means that you have dove deeply into the passage. The passage has permeated your mind and soul deeply. And then out of that, you've carefully extracted and crafted expressions that just crystallize it while retaining its dynamic sequencing and the energy of it through the person, right? First person if it's I language, and through the energy of verbs. Not to mention trying to get to a concept level. Boy, that's a high mark. But aim for it and you'll find it moves you very close to being ready to teach or preach a passage for the benefit of others.